Hello, and welcome to your most obedient and humble servant. This is a women's history podcast where we feature 18th and early 19th century women's letters that don't get as much attention as we think they should. I'm your host, Catherine Garrett. This episode is part of our season on wit. Today, I am so excited to be speaking with Dr. Pat Kalajian and Dr. Cindy Damon-Bach of the Catharine Maria Sedgwick Online Letters Project. Dr. Kalajian is a professor emerita of interdisciplinary studies at California State University and the editor and project director of the Sedgwick Online Letters Project. Dr. Damon-Bach is an editor of the project and a professor of English at Salem State University. Thank you both so much for being on the show.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting us. We're excited to talk about our project.
I first heard about this at a conference of the Association of Documentary Editing, and I thought it just seemed absolutely perfect. And I've been using your website and digging through these letters ever since. Pat, as the project director, can you tell me a little bit more about the project? How did it come to be?
Well, thanks for asking. Our project is a born digital edition of American author Catharine Maria Sedgwick's outgoing letters. When Cindy and I, with our third editorial board member who couldn't be here today, Deborah Gussman, started this project, we were really motivated by this absence of scholarly infrastructure for Sedgwick scholars. There is no full biography, for example. The bulk of Sedgwick's letters are at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and most of those have been scanned to microfilm. But microfilm doesn't make things easy to access, and so they remain out of reach for most scholars. Several hundred more letters are scattered in archives around the country and in Europe. So making Sedgwick's letters available in transcription seemed like a great way to encourage more incisive research and analysis. Because we're trained as literary scholars and not historians, we began by going to Camp Edit, an editing workshop sponsored by the Association for Documentary Editing. And then in 2017, we were invited to be a founding edition of a digital hub that is now the primary source cooperative at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And then we received our first National Endowment for the Humanities. It's called the Scholarly Editions and Translations Grant. We received that in 2019. And then we were just recently refunded for another 2 years this past January.
When you say born digital, do you mean that you're not planning on publishing a paper edition?
That is correct. We did think about doing a print edition, and it's still maybe a little bit in the back of Cindy's head anyway, not mine. With this technology, it just makes things so much easier to access, and it's so much more democratizing than just having print editions in university libraries.
I think that makes a ton of sense. So you talked about how it's a little bit difficult to access her papers, and there maybe hasn't been a lot of study on Catharine Maria Sedgwick. Who was Catharine Maria Sedgwick, and why are we putting her papers online?
She was the most highly regarded woman writer of the early national period of American literature. By the mid-1820s, she was praised as the nation's premier authoress. We put that in air quotes. And within the next decade, her work had been republished in England and translated to French and German, Italian, Swedish, Dutch, and Danish. She wrote in a lot of different genres. She wrote novels and short stories, sketches, didactic novellas, biography, travel books. And she wrote for a variety of audiences. She wrote for educated adult audiences, juveniles, kind of an elite class, working class readers. She really ran the gamut. She published 20 books and more than 150 short works in her career. And we always like to bring this up as a measure of her really exceptional fame. In 1834, she was selected for inclusion in the first volume of the National Portrait Gallery of Distinguished Americans. She was one of only 4 writers included and the only woman besides Martha Washington.
Wow. As a former editor of the Martha Washington papers, we're in an exclusive club there. Why do you think, after this sort of exceptional level of fame, she's translated into all these languages? I've never heard of her. I imagine that a lot of our listeners will not have heard of her. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think in spite of her fame among her contemporaries, Sedgwick's reputation and her work were really, this is like so many, like most women writers actually, either demeaned or ignored by the late 19th and early 20th century literary historians and anthologists. There's a demonstrable masculine's bias in the development of the American literary canon. And it takes a lot of effort over time to change the perception of literary history, especially after it's been there for like 100 years. So we're working on it. We're trying to change that, but it takes time. But we think that this is changing. Her work has been a successful part of the women writers' recovery movement that was undertaken by literary scholars from about 1980 on. And there's growing evidence that she's being reintegrated into the canon and into literary history. The Catharine Maria Sedgwick Society, that was founded by Cindy, has been going strong for more than 25 years. It encourages scholarship and connects Sedgwick to other writers of her era, both men and women. All 6 of her major novels are now available in print in scholarly editions and a couple in more popular editions. And her short fiction is now in college-level anthologies. These are all big, important steps towards making someone canonical. And in fact, one study found her to be among the top 12 authors now taught in 19th century American literature survey courses. So
that's great.
It's working.
Yes. That's fabulous. I've been saying Maria. Is it Catharine Maria Sedgwick?
We don't really know. I say Mariah, you say Maria. It doesn't matter.
All right. What does the Catharine Maria Sedgwick Society do? Is it like a fan club?
No. Well, yes and no. It is a fan club, but it's a scholarly fan club. Cindy, you should talk about this.
Well, our goal was to find each other first in 1997 after an amazing conference on women writers at Trinity College. It was important to meet people who were already familiar with Sedgwick. And now Susan K. Harris complimented us at one conference when she was the keynote speaker and said, now we can say there's such a field as Sedgwick studies. It's pretty awesome. And we've mentored young scholars now, and they're now not so young and taking lead roles. After 20 years, I finally stepped down. But it's going strong, I think. I'm really proud.
That's fantastic. You mentioned that your background is in sort of English and literary studies. From that perspective, how would you describe her letters? What do you think is important about making her letters available? And when you first sort of discovered and started working with her letters, what did it tell you about Catharine?
We think that her letters are fascinating on a whole variety of levels. We started with the idea that it would give insight into her work, the situations she found herself in, and then were transported into her fiction. But, she's just an engaging writer in her letters. She's smart and she's witty. She's snarky at times, very snarky. In fact, we joke around that we need to have a tag for her snark. She's really, amazingly open about her feelings, which I think is something that maybe is a lost art to write publicly, if you will. At least to a reader about how you're feeling. She doesn't seem to have a huge ego, so there's none of that sort of posing or posturing that you might find in others. In the context of the 19th century or early 19th century, she's a single woman by choice in a world that valued marriage. But she didn't live as a single woman alone. She lived in the family homes of her brothers and sisters. And she seems to have gotten along with just about everybody in her family. She had 6 siblings. They all married. And I think she had 37 nieces and nephews.
Wow.
And she communicated with a lot of them and helped raise a lot of them. On top of that, so she had this intimate knowledge of the private world of women. But then she also had this public side to her where she was extremely well known. She traveled widely. She was a successful author and really could have lived independently. She made plenty of money to do that. She just seemed comfortable in that family setting.
I think the one that we picked for today is one of the best to use because it touches on her religion as a Unitarian, on her social networks, people beyond her immediate family, as well as her intimate relationships with the people she's talking about in the letter. And it talks about what she's reading and what she's translating, which is another whole side of her. And what she's recently submitted that I was trying to find this morning, an unsigned piece. And it's funny. I mean, we also wish not just a snarky label, but just one for funny, making jokes. The Sedgwick family was a fun family. People really liked them. They had great conversations and played family games and were well loved in their towns and in New York City, where she lived. Two of her brothers were lawyers in New York City. So she also talks about village life and urban life, which is pretty extraordinary, as well as life abroad.
It's interesting to me that she was so successful and financially stable, and then she sort of chose to live that lifestyle of staying with family members, which in a lot of the other women's letters who I cover, sometimes it seems that women are sort of forced to do that. If their husband dies or something like that, they end up in debt. They sort of are dependent on family. I imagine it's just one of the few options that women had at the time period, but that she has such a well-connected, interesting family, it's less of something that she's trapped in and might be something that she really enjoyed.
I would say absolutely that she was living in a family totally by choice. She really wanted to have a child. This way she got children. For her to be useful was really important, and to be contributing member and helping people. And that was just a core of her identity. So she wasn't sitting around being a guest in her siblings' houses. She was a crucial piece.
Interesting. Do you feel like knowing more about her life and interacting with her letters and editing her letters, has that changed the way that you interact with her fiction?
Definitely. Through her letters, you get to see insights into scenes in her novels and short stories, and also her writing anxiety. She writes a fair number of sketches, and they're closely based on events in her own life. So the conversations and the settings and the current events, it's been really fascinating to me.
That's so fascinating. So what goals do you have for the Sedgwick Papers online project?
Our original goal was to publish the full content of all her outgoing letters, unexpurgated. We don't make any editorial choices other than, is this a dash or a comma? We really try to stick to the content.
I'm quoting Pat, our biggest goal is to rewrite American literary history. She's clearly a crucial piece. And the other goal is who will use them, everyone, besides Sedgwick scholars or even scholars of 19th century women's literature. I think historians, I really hope secondary school teachers. One of the things that encouraged us was there was one edition of her letters published in 1871 as a tribute to her. She had died in 1867. I did a search. How many people had searched for Dewey's Life and Letters of Catharine Sedgwick? And I found people from all walks of life, besides doctors and historians, and women's studies people, but there were people interested in cooking and travels.
Another goal that we kind of developed as we were doing the digital edition and working with the metadata and tagging and so on is that we've really committed ourselves to identifying women that are mentioned in this. Sometimes we can only find them in something like Find a Grave. It's not the world's most reliable thing, but women don't appear that much in, for example, the Library of Congress Names Authority file or SNAC or, any of the more formal databases. So we're trying to get as much information as we can about the women, even women that are just mentioned, aren't friends, or, they're just mentioned in a letter. We still try to identify them.
That's so important. I came across the same thing working with the letters of Martha Washington, of how many people you'll have to find. You can find who their husband is. And it's like, this is just some guy who owned a house. Why does he get an encyclopedia entry and she doesn't? So the letter we're going to read today is a letter from Catharine Maria Sedgwick to Eliza Cabot Follen. Who was Follen, and what was their relationship like?
Eliza Cabot, not yet Follen. She's going to get married after this letter.
Oh, okay.
In the same year. They met in the 1820s through Eliza's cousin, Susan Higginson Channing, who was a good friend of Sedgwick. So Susan Channing is a little bit older, and Eliza Follen is a year and a half older than Catharine. And at this point, Sedgwick is 38, Eliza is 39 and a half, and about to get married, which is pretty impressive. And it was Catharine Sedgwick who actually set her up with her future husband, Charles Follen. who was a German immigrant, who said he learned English reading Catharine Sedgwick's novel Redwood, her second publication, and was a Unitarian himself. So they have been corresponding since the early 1820s, about 6 or 7 years into the relationship. And she was a family favorite. Eliza was very high-spirited and fun-loving and good friend of Sedgwick's brother, Robert. And she's an abolitionist. She's a writer herself. She's writing poetry, and Sedgwick quotes one of her poems at the beginning of her third novel, published in 1827, Hope Leslie. And they, as you'll hear in the letter, they talk about their publication. They really are very, very close. And I think that there might have been romantic feelings. However, we all know from Carol Smith Rosenberg that that was common. But boy, does she gush in some of her letters about, how much she misses this other piece of her. She's definitely a very, very close friend.
I'm glad to have you say that, because I was picking up on a little bit of that as well. So what's going on in Sedgwick's life at the time that she wrote this letter?
We can try piecing that together. She's writing from New York, where she is living either with her brother Robert, who is a lawyer, and in partnership with her brother Henry, a little bit older than Robert. Robert was the closest to her in age above her, and then she has her younger brother Charles. You'll hear that she's a little depressed at the beginning of the letter, and I'm guessing she's in New York and she's finished one book and it's out. What am I going to do next? I'm just guessing.
Her oldest sister had died the previous year. I kind of think she had seasonal affective disorder.
I was going to say it's February.
Exactly. Exactly. And, her moods change seasonally, as do most people's.
Are there any people mentioned in the letter that you want to introduce that'll help people understand as we're reading it?
I'll leave some of them out because there are a lot of people mentioned in this letter. And I think that that's indicative of how many intersections, lives that Eliza and Catharine had. So even though Catharine lived mainly in Western Massachusetts and Stockbridge and Lenox, that's where she was raised, and then also in New York, she had a large number of friends in the Boston area, which is where Eliza Cabot lived. And she mentions several of them. So the first one she mentions is Susan Channing, who, as Cindy said, was Eliza's cousin and Sedgwick's friend. Then there's another Susan and a Mary, and those are Eliza's sisters. And Harry, he was pretty much her literary agent. And then Harry's wife, Jane, is originally from Boston and a part of this circle of friends that includes another person that's named early on, and that's Caroline Danforth. And then the second set of people that are mentioned tend to be writers and editors. So Eliza was a writer and a translator, and she's about to launch a serial publication for juvenile readers called The Well-Spent Hour. So there's some talk back and forth about contributions to that. And then the third intersection is the Unitarian Church. And both Sedgwick and Follen were early and important members of what was then still a relatively new denomination. For example, towards the end of the letter, she talks about what a mess the new congregation in New York is in.
I appreciate that you put the effort into try to identify all these people, and I think that does help sort of to understand what's going on. And now let's dig into the letter. Catharine Maria Sedgwick to Eliza Cabot Follen, February 18th, 1828. My dear Eliza, it is a great while since I have written to you, but I have felt assured that you were happy within and without, in the house and by the way. I have been and am in a torpid condition, feeling no power to rouse myself, and having nothing to impart. I hope I shall not sink into absolute nonentity. But my tendencies are all that way. I intended to have answered a very kind and gratuitous letter from Susan Channing before I wrote to you, but when I write to her, as it is a rare occasion, I must call forth my energies, if any poking and raking can enliven them. To you, I have the privilege of being as slipshod and as stupid as I feel, and of knowing, dear Eliza, that you will bear with me. I received Mary's very kind letter, and was truly rejoiced to know that she was safe in the narrow house, and screaming among her fellows. I should, you know, dear Eliza, rejoice to pillow my head once more on your pillow, and I think I could resign myself to a week of your vigils. But this is not the time for me to go to Boston, for many reasons, and therefore, being very reasonable, I shall not go. 3rd March. I can hardly believe that so much time has passed away since I have written to you. And but for the fixture of the date on my first page, I would not believe it. Since then, how many sweet letters have I received from you? Not so very many either, but 2, worth a gross of mine. I begin to fear, dearest E., that, for the punishment of my sins, I am denied ever finishing another letter to you. I was called away yesterday, and before I could return again, I sprained my thumb. And now I write with very uncomfortable sensations. But I think the pain is easier to bear than to repress the desire to write. You have been very sick, but even that, as Jane writes me, has not checked the ever-living fountain of your sweet spirit. You have found out, and most beautifully expressed in your last letter, the secret of happiness. I have no doubt of it, and I believe that a great proportion of the suffering in this world results from a constant opposition to the will of God. Not always known to be such, often very blind and ignorant, but sometimes, alas, perverse, willful. I think if it were only required of us to be passive, to sit still and be acted upon, we might always attain acquiescence. But when it comes to resisting our strongest inclinations, to going exactly counter to a course in which we are impelled by a force stronger than wind and tide, then what can get us on but being fellow workers with God? Then there's a little bit of letter damage. I am glad you have undertaken a work for which no one is so well qualified and which may be so important. It is not affectation in me when I say that I do not consider myself capable of aiding you, or at least as capable as those whose contributions are at your command. If I were in Boston, where I could be stimulated and directed, I might do something. I do not exactly understand your plan. After I have seen your first number, I shall know better what you want. I have, simply because you requested it, written a little piece which I shall send to you by the first opportunity. And if it does not suit your purpose, dear Eliza, throw it under the table. My author pride is not at stake, and I would not have your partiality for me obscure your editorial gusto. Though, heaven knows, there is little of the elder Brutus in your composition. Do you know anything of poor Mrs. Hale's fate? She wrote me a piteous letter, asking aid for her magazine. To have refused her would have been sending away a starving beggar, so I have translated an article for her from the French, Revue Sigh, and partly promised to continue contributions. But Harry tells me the work is a hopeless affair, and that to contribute to it is only to protract losses. Her great patron seems to be a Mr. Blake, rector of some church in Boston, who, judging from a letter he wrote me, has all the complacency of the hierarchy concentrated in himself. I have just finished a little story for Roy's Legendary. I was provoked with myself after I promised, and being far enough from the working mood, it proved a poor affair. If you can get at the review, do get the number for September 1827 and read the memoir of Mad Guizot. It is excessively interesting, and will be particularly so to you. I have just finished Cyril Thornton. There is a good deal of talent and an air of truth and reality about it that makes it deeply interesting. And then the hero tells his own story without one particle of egotism. Do you Bostonians know anything about the dismal state of the new church here? Have you not one young man of talent and piety among you? Alas, that church tells a far worse tale of us than Lewis Tappan. My Marianne's criticism was quite piquant on Mr. Tappan. Why, she said, did he not find out sooner how bad he was? What will dear Jeanie do without you and Caroline? I hope you will persuade her to remain till April. I have had a letter from poor Mrs. Howe. She seems calm in sorrow, so deep, so overwhelming. My best love to Mary and Susan. What is poor Mary to do if both you and Susan are quill-bound? She had better call in my aid, for I am quite inclined to return to the distaff, the natural duty of women. I have received the most exquisite Valentine you ever saw, purporting to be from Sir Walter Scott. That it is not from him is too true, and that its graceful couplets are indited by a false Valentine, a woman, is true also. But it is exquisite. And then normally there's a signature at the end of these, but there's no signature for this one. It's unsigned. I think it's fantastic. I think you get a lot of her personality. Towards the end, when she's just adding these little notes, if you can see the actual paper that the letter is written on, she's just throwing in little sentences and ideas and writing all around the edges of the manuscript. And even on the page where she has the address, she's just fitting as much as she possibly can into this letter.
I had a miserable experience. I was studying her correspondence with Anna Jameson, which is 16 years, which is really exciting. And we have to always use the microfilm first, the scan of the microfilm. So it's like third generation to begin with. And it was cross-written the entire letter, meaning that she writes horizontally across the page, then turns the page 90 degrees and writes slightly larger hand, fills the entire page a second time. My eyes were going crazy. And I went to the Mass Historical and I said, can I please see the original? And it came out, and it's always Christmas when you go there, but when the letter came out with brown ink covered by red ink, I screeched with happiness. I squealed just like the girls in this letter. I'm like, oh, yay.
That was thoughtful of her.
Yeah.
The other thing was that paper was expensive and not easily available. Postage could be pricey. And, she used letter sheets that folded into 4 pages. And she really tried to fill it as much as she can. You could see from actual photograph of it on the 3rd page, she indents. And that's for the sealing wax on the other side, so it doesn't bleed through and ruin the letter. She's really trying to say as much as she possibly can and make the letter worthwhile, because sometimes the letters, if they went by mail, would be paid for by the recipient. So you wanted to make it worthwhile to your recipient. Somebody jokes at some point, I think it's her youngest brother, Charles, who gives her a hard time sometimes about all the marginal writing all over everything and filling every inch of the paper.
Well, that said, her brothers, at least Robert, would say that he has reread her letter and that her letters are like balm to him. So she really had high standards for what a good letter was. And sometimes that's a subject of self-derision. She'll say, oh my gosh, I have said nothing worthwhile in this letter.
I like those letters. Oh, that's great. I haven't really thought about that aspect of it. If you're paid to receive a letter, you hope there's something good in it. This is the last episode that we're recording of the season, and having it open with a line about how torpid and sinking into absolute nonentity, I fully understand that feeling. I thought that was funny. Yeah, so we talked a little bit how she sort of starts out, perhaps feels like sort of a seasonal depression, just doesn't feel like writing. And that comes up again later where she says she wasn't in the mood to write a story, so it turned out to be not a great piece. Do you know anything about that one?
Well, that was the rabbit hole I fell into this morning. So the irony here is that Mrs. Hale's adventure of editing the ladies' magazine, which was in Boston at that time before it was turned into Godey's Lady Book in Philadelphia, that one succeeded. And Nathaniel Willis's, she calls it Roy's Legendary. Well, it was edited by Nathaniel Willis and Roy was the publisher. And his folded after just 2 volumes. So it took me some time to find, the one had just come out, was published in December of 1827. So it's just hit the stands. It's a gift book annual. So she can't have been writing the one story that we do know she submitted to him, which was a very long story, 43 pages. But this morning I was going through, after I found the second and last volume, there's a story in there called The Stepmother. And a scholar in 1959 had attributed it to Sedgwick, but I had no idea of the basis of that. But I can see she's using events and names that she's used before. It isn't a very great story, at least on the first read. Now that one's 80 pages long. So I think this is another unwritten joke. I've written a small affair and it's not very good. Well, it's not very good in part because it goes on and on and on.
That completely changes the meaning of that sentence to me now that you've found the story and it's 80 pages. That's hysterical. Oh, that's great. For these papers publishing projects, people are like, why does it take so long when you're just transcribing a letter? Why can't you just transcribe it and put it online? Well, she's mentioning casually a magazine that only released 2 issues. It takes such digging to find these things and identify them. So if you want it to be a usable project and you want to have any type of useful annotation at all, it can take some time, and then you find these really cool little discoveries. I like when she talks about her friendship with Eliza, and she says, when she's writing to her cousin, she feels like she has to be putting on a show, but when she's writing to her, she can be as slipshod and as stupid as I feel. That's a timeless feeling. When you were reading this letter, what's something that sort of struck you as sort of snarky and funny?
When she gets a letter from the rector who is the patron for Susan Hale, judging from a letter he wrote me, has all the complacency of the hierarchy concentrated in himself. It's like, quite the put down.
So good. The project that she's working on with Mrs. Hale, which magazine was that?
So this is Sarah Josepha Hale. She was an author herself. She wrote at least one novel called Northwood. And she's most famous actually for editing first the Ladies Magazine, which was the one that Reverend John Blake founded and then sought her out to edit. And she did that for about 8 years. And then the Ladies Magazine and Godey's were merged. And Hale became the editor of that as well. She was the editor for almost 50 years of the most important, I think it was the highest selling magazine in the United States. It had a huge impact. And Sedgwick was a contributor to it over time, but there were a lot of women writers that contributed to Godey's. The founder was a Congregationalist minister and was Calvinist. I can imagine a little pomposity there. I mean, it also points out that Harry wasn't infallible, her brother, in his judgment, thinking that hers is bound to fail. And then it turns out that the one that Nathaniel Parker Willis edited was, kind of a big name back then. Again, not so well known today. That didn't make it.
Yeah, that's another thing. So with each of these letters, you're getting one person's perspective at a certain moment.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that perspective aligns with reality and sometimes not.
Sometimes not so much.
When she says, I begin to fear, dearest E, that for the punishment of my sins, I'm denied ever finishing another letter to you. That made me laugh. I imagine she's trying to write this letter. It's been almost a whole month, and then she hurts her thumb. So she's powering through it. She's going to write this letter.
And then some other intrusion comes
Yes.
along, too, to interrupt. She complains about that a little bit in her letters, especially when she's in New York, that it's difficult for her to sit down and work, whether it's writing a story or writing a letter. Too many social requirements, for a famous woman.
And all those nieces and nephews, too. When she talks about, I received Mary's very kind letter, was rejoiced to know that she was safe in the narrow house and screaming among her fellows. Do you know what's going on there?
She was happy to be back among friends and so on. The Narrow House is the name that they gave to the house that Eliza and her sisters, Mary and Susan, lived in together as single women. So Mary was just coming home and screaming among her fellows, her sisters, happy to be back home.
A narrow house with all of the women that are all screaming among their fellows. That's a great little image.
It is.
I would just add that it really was a narrow house, I believe, in part because they had narrowed circumstances. Both parents had died, and that's why they are all living together. So, of course, there aren't any extra guest rooms. And it was common for people to share a bed and share a pillow.
And this is the line that made me think a little bit, where she says, I should, dear Eliza, rejoice to pillow my head once more on your pillow and resign myself to a week of your vigils. I'm like, oh, they're very close.
They are very close.
She has the next section talking about resigning yourself to God's will and things like that. And so we've talked several times about her as a Unitarian and Unitarian faith. Does that come up a lot in her correspondence?
It does with Eliza, especially about this time period, because they are trying to get a minister into this new church that has started in New York. And Sedgwick feels like the Boston people had kind of cornered the market on the on the great ministers, and needed to be a little bit more generous in sharing the wealth, the real crowd gathering kinds of ministers.
Have you not one young man of talent and piety among you?
Yeah, she's actually, she even gets to the point where she's hoping that after Eliza marries Charles Follen, who was ordained a Unitarian minister as well, that they would move to New York and kind of share the pulpit. Why she adores Eliza so much, I think, is she must have had a kind of very strong, I hate to use the word spiritual because it has such a vague, foggy meaning to us now, but I think she really thought that Eliza just kind of had the corner on the market of really understanding her place in the universe. And probably she would have said in another life, if she'd known that what was possible today, she would have encouraged Eliza to be minister.
I just wanted to add to the passage where she says, I believe that a great proportion of the suffering in this world results from a constant opposition to the will of God, not always to know to be such. I think if it were only required of us to be passive, to sit still and be acted upon, we might always attain acquiescence. And I think this ties to her fiction because she is always saying it is not a woman's role to be passive. We are not required to be passive. We are required to be useful and active and transact. But if we have to wait sometimes, it's more of a wait and work rather than being passive. You're still doing something to move forward. And that's where the being fellows workers with God comes in. Sedgwick is raising money to start a school for poor children, a Sunday school, not a church school as much as it is held on Sunday to teach poor kids how to read and write. Eliza, too, is a very active, benevolent worker.
Was Catherine an abolitionist or Eliza an abolitionist?
Eliza was an abolitionist. Charles Follen was an abolitionist. He got kicked off of the faculty of Harvard for being too ardent an abolitionist. And a lot of Sedgwick's friends were abolitionists. She was anti-slavery.
She has a lot of company. I mean, Emerson and Hawthorne and other people like that. Because there are other people, especially women at the time, who are really active abolitionists, we think that everybody should have been. Actually, it's interesting. The story that I think she may have written around this time was about a mixed race romance. If it turns out to be Sedgwick, I shouldn't even talk about it till I know for sure. But that was definitely on her mind. She has an interracial relationship in her most recent novel in 1827.
I don't know whether it has come up yet or not because I'm reading further ahead than where this letter is, so it's hard for me to remember where things land. But Eliza Cabot's brother was in a relationship with a Creole woman in the Caribbean. And in fact, the wife and the stepdaughter came to New York, I think, or Boston. And it was quite a scandal that this member of a very, very influential family, the Cabots, have an interracial marriage.
That's so interesting.
And Sedgwick was very sympathetic, didn't seem at all judgy in the letters that pertain to that. But that's another story, another letter.
Wow, and that's why you should go online and check out the Catharine Maria Sedgwick letters. All right, let me see.
I know you wanted to ask about Madame Guizot.
Yes.
Pauline Guizot was a French writer and journalist, and this is speculation, but then that's what we do. But I think Sedgwick might have thought that Eliza would enjoy this memoir. Pauline Guizot had recently passed away, and so this was someone writing a memoir that included her, because Pauline married a man who was 14 years younger than she was. And Eliza was about to marry someone who was 9 years her junior. So just a guess, but maybe.
That makes sense. Okay. I did want to mention she has the line where she says, returning to the distaff, the natural duty of a woman. What's she saying there?
I think it's a joke. Cindy doesn't necessarily, I don't think.
I'm convinced she did do a lot of sewing, but I don't know that she ever did any weaving. She did cooking for the family, and she writes about that. But I think this is definitely a joke. Pat convinced me.
It's a reference to the distaff side, the female side of things. I think you wondered if it was a kind of feminist joke. And I'd love to say, I think everybody who studies Sedgwick would love to say that she was an early feminist. And I think in many ways she is kind of maybe a proto-feminist. I think to call her a feminist is a bit of a stretch. I mean, she chose to be single, but she also, in all of her novels, the women the protagonists start out believing that they are going to be single and figure out a way to make a meaningful life without marriage. And then they end up being married at the end. But she did, like Cindy said, she did do a lot of domestic chores. She sewed, cooked, and she nursed the sick. She weaned their babies for her sisters-in-law. I think she had more of a choice. It wasn't a necessity, right? She could say, I'll do this for you. I'll help this way, whatever. And a running joke between Catherine and Eliza is that Eliza and her one sister, Susan, were artists and writers and doing more traditionally masculine kinds of tasks to earn money because they needed it, while Mary was left to do the domestic work. And then it's also that Mary really likes doing the domestic work.
And I do think once this short sketches and stories are stirred into the mix so that it's not heavily, the research and familiarity is not heavily based in novels, but it includes the rest of the body of her work, you're going to see that she celebrates in her nonfiction sketches. You can figure out who is who. She's celebrating single women who did humble things, who helped their community. And she's also featuring feminist men. But Sedgwick really loved being a mother and an aunt, and that was not something she wanted to give up. And one of her brothers did say, her oldest brother, actually, Theodore, said, if you get married, you're not going to have time to write. And so there was some support from her own brothers about choosing her own path. And she didn't like being alone all the time. The frustration of being single and number two in people's lives comes up all the time in her letters.
Clearly, it would be inaccurate to describe her as what we would think of as a feminist. But I think just looking at the way she lived her life and all of that, but she definitely seems like a progressive-minded person. And you could look at things she does and make an argument about the place of women at her time, for sure. The very last thing she writes that we have is about the Valentine. Valentine that is not from Sir Walter Scott. Do we know anything about what's going on there?
No.
No. That's fair.
I can guess. I know that Susan was something of an artist, Eliza's sister, and maybe that's who she's referring to because she does tell this story, right? And Sedgwick was a big fan of Scott and quoted from him a lot and probably based maybe some of her characters, at least were inspired by characters in Scott.
Somebody in that three-girl household, because she knows it's a woman and she knows whose house it came from, yeah.
Somebody wrote her a Valentine.
Someone who would know her well enough to know that she adored Scott, right?
Yes.
And would love the joke.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I love the idea that these things were something that was treasured by the family, that they would keep reading and rereading. And it's like having the person with you.
Yeah. And thanks to all her friends and family, every time someone died, they shipped the letters back to the Sedgwicks. So we have these correspondences. Yeah, just amazing.
Yeah, it's quite a trove of letters. She came from a well-known family, but, she's really a standalone person. She's not known because she's married to somebody famous. She is known for her work, really.
If somebody was interested in reading her fiction or any of her work, is there some place you would recommend for people to start?
Well, the one I use frequently in my literature survey classes, ironically, it's not Hope Leslie, which is quite long, but people love that. That's her best known novel.
Hope Leslie?
Hope Leslie. It's her third book, 1827. Set in the Puritan times, 25 years before Hawthorne wrote his Scarlet Letter. But New England Tale is 16 chapters, and it's somewhat autobiographical. It seems to be set in her own childhood home. It gives you a sense of how she both is writing, well, it's her very first attempt. So she's writing to see if she can write more than a short story, but she's also going out of bounds. And I won't spoil it any more than to say it's not what you think.
Intriguing.
Yeah.
I think one of the ways to popularize her is if we could get a mini-series made out of one of her novels.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
And I think Hope Leslie would be a great miniseries.
But I would also make sure we give a plug to the Sedgwick Stories online archive that I'm co-editor of. Deborah Gussman started it, and then I have been assigning my students to transcribe and make notes. And there are almost 100 stories up, maybe 70 stories up there now. So it's sedgwickstories.org. So they could find a title and read a sketch or a short story.
That's great, yeah. We'll link to that in the show notes so people can check that out. They'll check your project out. I think this is a fantastic way to end our season on wit. It's a great witty letter, and I hope everybody goes and reads all of the Catharine Maria Sedgwick stories that they can.
Katie, it's really been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, really.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on, Pat and Cindy. It's been just a delight. Thank you so much for listening. To my listeners, I am, as ever, your most obedient and humble servant. Thank you very much. Your Most Obedient and Humble Servant is a production of R2 Studios at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University. I'm Catherine Garrett, the creator and host of this podcast. Jeanette Patrick and Jim Mbusky are the executive producers. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to listen to past episodes and check out more great podcasts from R2 Studios. We tell unexpected stories based on the latest research to connect listeners with the past. So head to r2studios.org to start listening.